Montana Territory, July 1881, the day Elira Granger was cast out of town. The sky stayed clear, not a single cloud to give her the comfort of rain. She stood in the middle of the dusty street, arms wrapped tight around herself, her wedding ring thrown at her boots, and her husband's voice still echoing behind her like a bullet that would not stop. "You should be ashamed," he had said, loud enough for every ear in Helena to hear. "You ruined this marriage." But she had not. He had. And still, they looked at her like she was the one who'd broken a vow. The one who'd fallen into someone else's arms. The one who hadn't kept the home. Elira's cheeks burned as shutters closed and whispers stirred like wine through the cottonwoods. Behind her, the general store door slammed shut and Mrs. Cummings shook her head in that sharp, disappointed way she saved for drunks and harlots. Elira didn't cry. She just picked up her satchel, tugged her shawl tight, and walked. She had no children, no money of her own, and nowhere to go but away. 3 days later, blistered and half-starved, she stumbled into the edge of a cattle camp near the Musselshell River. The land was wide and golden, the sky endless. Her boots were nearly falling apart. Her lips cracked. She had not eaten since the heel of bread she'd saved in her skirt pocket. The first person she saw was a man on a bay gelding, riding down the slope with the sun behind him. Lean, tall, and covered in trail dust, he slowed when he spotted her and swung down from the saddle in one swift move. "You hurt." His voice was low and rough, but not unkind. Elira blinked up at him. Her throat was dry. "I just need water," she said, barely above a whisper. He took his canteen from the saddle horn and handed it over. "I'm not going to ask how you ended up out here, but you do not belong alone on this land." He watched her drink, eyes steady. "You need food?" She nodded. He led her to the fire where a pot of beans simmered. She sat on a log and ate slow, careful bites while he leaned on his heels nearby, arms crossed. A few other cowhands glanced her way, but none came close. When she had eaten, he finally asked, "What is your name?" "Elira Granger," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. He nodded once. "Truett Ellison." She looked up at him. His face was sun-browned, the lines around his eyes deep from years in the sun. He had the kind of quiet about him that did not need proving. "You married?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "No," he said. "You?" She looked down at her hands. "Not anymore." He did not push, just sat beside her, not close, but not far either. The wind shifted, lifting the edge of her shawl. She caught it, holding it tight. "I was not the one who cheated," she said after a long minute. "But I was the one they blamed." Truett's jaw tightened. He looked out at the horizon. People are always quick to shame a woman, even when it is a man who did wrong. She turned her head to him. There was no pity in his voice, just plain truth. He stood after a while. "I ride east in the morning. Got a cabin half a day's ride from here. You can come if you want. I will not ask for anything. Just offer a roof." Elira hesitated. "I do not owe you anything." "No," he said. "You do not." She looked around. The other cowhands had wandered off. The river glinted in the distance. And for the first time in days, she did not feel like she was about to fall apart. "I will come," she said. They left at dawn. Truett gave her his extra horse, a calm gelding named Jasper. Elira rode stiffly at first, not used to the saddle, but Truett kept the pace slow. They did not talk much, but she noticed how he checked behind them every so often, how he kept one hand near the rifle slung across his back. By midday, they reached a small homestead tucked near a wooded bluff. The cabin was weathered but solid. A corral stood off to one side, and a garden patch, dry but still growing, stretched behind it. Truett tied the horses, then opened the door and stood back. "Go on in." Elira stepped through the doorway. The inside smelled of pine and smoke. There was a bed in the corner, a table near the stove, and a chair with a blanket draped over it. "You can have the bed," he said behind her. "I will sleep in the barn." She turned. "That is not necessary." He just nodded once and went back out. That night, she lit a lantern and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, she heard the horses shifting, and far off, Truett's footsteps in the barn. She did not sleep much. The next week passed quiet. Elira helped with the garden, cooked meals, and mended what she could find that needed stitching. She did not ask questions about his past, and he did not ask about hers. One evening, she was kneading dough when he came in from chopping wood, his shirt damp with sweat. He washed at the basin, then leaned against the doorway, watching her. You do not act like a woman who was cast out. Elira looked up. How should I act? He shrugged. Broken. Bitter. You are not. She wiped her hands and faced him. I was. The first few days. But then I realized I was not the one who should be ashamed. Something flickered in his eyes. Then he stepped forward, slow, careful. You are not, he said. You never were. She felt her heart catch. That night, after supper, they sat out on the porch. The stars hung low. The wind was soft. Truett stirred beside her. You do not have to stay. If you want to go to a bigger town, find work, I will get you there. Elira turned to him. Do you want me to leave? No, he said, voice firm. But I want you to have a choice again. She watched him. The way he looked away, like he was bracing for her to say she would go. But she leaned her head against his shoulder. I already made my choice, she said quiet. He looked down at her, surprised. You are the only one who looked at me without shame, she said. The only person who saw me and did not turn away. Truett reached up and touched her hand where it rested on his arm. You are the only woman I will ever need, he said, voice low, steady. Elira closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. And the night wrapped around them like a promise. By late August, the ground had hardened and the garden gave up the last of its beans and squash, curling back into itself beneath the dry wind. Elira stood barefoot in the dirt, skirts lifted just above the knees, pulling up the final onions with careful hands. The scent clung to her fingers, sharp and honest. Truett had been gone since morning, rounding up a stray yearling that had wandered toward the breaks. His absence settled over the cabin in a quiet way, not empty, just waiting. She'd grown used to the rhythm of his departures and returns, the way the door creaked differently when he came in, how his boots fell heavier than hers on the porch. When he did come back that evening, she was bent over the stove, her hair tied back with a strip of muslin. He leaned his shoulder to the doorframe, silent a moment, arms crossed over his chest. You fixed the hinge, she said without turning. I did. It doesn't groan anymore. I missed it. Might undo the repair. She glanced over her shoulder. Don't you dare. He stepped inside and set his hat on the peg. You've been all right. The chickens got into the wash again. Should have built that fence taller. I told you they'd find a way. He reached over the door to unlace his gloves. You always this stubborn? Only when I'm right. She heard the edge of a chuckle in his breath, the low kind that never rose above his chest. She liked that sound more than she'd expected. Later, after the meal was cleared and the sky turned the color of iron, they sat near the stove while the coals faded. Elira pulled her mending into her lap, but her fingers stalled on a tear in Truett's shirt. Where'd you get this, Rip? She asked. Barbed wire. Caught it riding too close to the fence line. She ran her thumb along the frayed edge. Could have been your skin. Wasn't. You always that careful? No. But I'm steady. That counts for something. She threaded the needle and bent over the fabric. For a while, the only sound was the scratch of thread and the soft creak of the chair beneath him. I used to think steadiness was dull, she said quietly. And now, I think it's a kind of kindness. He looked over at her, eyes narrowing just a little. You had too many men full of fire and no staying power. I had one. He leaned back, resting his arm along the top of the chair beside him. Only takes one to make you wary. I'm not wary, she said. Not with you. The words settled between them like coals holding their heat through the dark. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her hand. He just watched her, the way he always did when she said something real. I've been thinking, he said after a while. There's land past the ridge. Flat enough for winter wheat. I could fence it come spring. She looked up from her stitching. You want to plant? I want to build something. More than what this place has been. She folded the shirt and set it on the table. You want help? He nodded once. She stood and crossed the floor, stopping just before him. Then I'll help. Truett reached up, slow, and touched a curl that had escaped her tie. You sure about staying? She slid her hand over his. I'm still here, aren't I? He stood, taller than her by a head, and stepped closer. Elira. She didn't look away. Yes. I meant what I said. You're the only woman I'll ever need. She didn't answer with words, just rose on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, soft and certain. His arms came around her, firm but careful, like he was holding something he meant to keep. And in that quiet room, With the wind outside and the stove cooling slow, Elira knew she'd already come home. The first snow arrived in the night, quiet as breath, softening the edges of the land until the world looked like it had been held in a hush. Elira stepped outside at daybreak, shawl wrapped tight, boots crunching through the fresh layer as she carried a pail to the well. Her fingers stung around the handle, but she welcomed the bite of cold it made the warmth indoors feel earned. Inside, Truett sat near the table, sharpening a draw knife with slow, deliberate strokes. He didn't speak as she entered, just glanced up once, nodded, and returned to his work. The fire crackled low in the stove. She set the pail near the basin and turned toward the hearth, rubbing her hands together. "You ever seen snow like this in Helena?" he asked after a long silence. "Only once," she said, kneeling to stir the coals. "It melted the next day. Never held like it does out here." He laid the knife down and leaned back. "It'll keep holding now. Come February, you'll be wishing you never saw another flake." "I don't mind the cold," she said, standing. "It's the stillness I'm getting used to." Truett looked at her then, eyes steady. "You miss the bustle?" She shook her head. "No, just learning what it means to let quiet be enough." He didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not a smile, but something close. That afternoon, they worked side by side in the shed behind the barn. Truett was building a feed bin from thick pine boards he'd milled in the fall. Elira held the planks steady while he drove the iron nails clean through. Her palms ached from the cold, but she didn't complain. "You always build things this careful?" she asked, brushing sawdust from her sleeve. "I don't see the point in doing something halfway," he said, measuring the next cut. "Hard work's only worth it if it lasts." She stepped back to watch him. "That how you see people too?" He paused, hammer in hand. "Sometimes. But people change more than timber. You can't always brace in the same way." She considered that. Still worth trying. He looked at her, then nodded once. "It is." By sundown, the bin stood finished in the corner of the shed. Elira leaned against the post, arms crossed, watching the light shift gold through the gaps in the roof. Truett wiped his hands on a rag and stepped beside her. "You ever work with wood before?" "No. My hands were meant for finer things, supposedly." "Who said that?" She gave him a dry look. "The same people who said I was too proud to be a proper wife." He didn't answer, just reached for her hand and turned it over, palm up. "Looks to me like they never knew what real work was." Elira swallowed, the heat of his touch rising through her wrist. "Neither did I. Until now." Back in the cabin, supper was simple: cornbread with dried apples stewed in sugar and a bit of salt pork. Afterward, they sat at the table with the oil lamp between them, its glow turning the edges of everything soft. "I've been thinking about spring," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "When the snow's gone and the ground gives again." He looked up from the ledger he was marking. "What about it?" "I'd like to try keeping a few hives. There's wild bees near the creek. I saw them when I went to wash clothes 3 weeks back." His brow lifted. "You know about bees?" "Enough to not get stung," she said, smiling faintly. "I used to help my uncle with his. He had 6 hives behind his barn in Missouri." Truett nodded slowly. "We can build boxes come thaw. I'll help with the frames." "I want to contribute," she said, her voice low but firm. "Not just in the kitchen or garden." "You already do," he said. "But if bees are what you want, they're yours." The lamp hissed quietly. She watched the way the light caught the worn edge of his collar, how his hands moved with care even when they were still. "I never thought I'd want to stay in one place," she said. "Not after what happened." He closed the ledger and met her gaze. "You staying because of me?" "I'm staying because of who I am when I'm with you." They sat in the hush that followed, something old and tender unfolding between them. Not hunger, not yearning, just the kind of knowing that came after all the noise had fallen away. He reached across the table, not fast, not needing to prove anything, and laced his fingers through hers. "You're not just the only woman I'll ever need," he said. "You're the only one I've ever trusted to build something worth keeping." Elira gripped his hand, the calluses brushing her palm like a promise. Outside, the snow thickened, but inside, the warmth held. By mid-December, the wind came down hard from the north, and the world turned to ice. The river froze in long sheets, and the pines near the bluff groaned under the weight of snow. Elira had taken to wearing wool under her skirts and wrapping her hair in a kerchief before stepping outside. The stove never cooled entirely, and Truett kept the logs stacked shoulder high against the back wall of the cabin, just beneath the overhang. One morning, as she was twisting dried sage into bundles for the pantry shelves, she heard Truett's boots returning from the barn. He stepped in, cheeks red, snow clinging to the hem of his coat. "There's a wagon stuck on the ridge," he said, brushing off his gloves. "Single team," Axel cracked. "Woman and her boy." She looked up sharply. "How old?" "Couldn't be more than 7. They got blankets, but not enough for the cold coming tonight." Elira didn't ask why he'd stopped to check. She wiped her hands on her apron, pulled her shawl off the peg, and reached for her boots. They rode out together, the horses picking their way through thigh-deep snow. The wagon was tilted where the front wheel had split, canvas bowed under the weight of frost. The woman, thin as a fence post and pale under her bonnet, had her arms around the boy, who shivered despite the quilt wrapped twice around him. Truett hitched their team behind the wagon. "We'll bring you to shelter. You'll freeze if you stay." The woman's hand trembled as she reached for her son. "I didn't think it had turned so fast." "We'll talk later," Elira said, helping the boy down. "Come on. We've got warmth and food." Back at the cabin, she wrapped the child in Truett's coat and settled him near the stove with a tin cup of broth. The mother, whose name was Alma, sat stiffly on the wooden chair, fingers curled around the cup Elira handed her. Elira knelt to stoke the fire higher. "Where were you headed?" "South," Alma said, voice hoarse. "My brother had a claim near Bozeman. He wrote in spring, said we'd be welcome." Elira nodded. "Long way to go with a child and no man to drive the team." Alma looked away. "He died in June. Fever took him. I didn't have much choice after." Truett stood near the door, arms crossed. "We'll keep you here through the storm. After that, I can ride out and see who's still near Bozeman that might be kin." Alma's eyes welled, but she blinked fast. "Don't want to burden you." "You're not," Elira said, firm. That night, Elira gave her bed to Alma and the boy, setting up a pallet near the stove for herself. Truett slept in the barn again without being asked. She heard him come in before dawn to stoke the fire and leave again before the sun rose. The storm held for 2 days. On the third, the sky cleared with a brittle blue light. Elira walked out to the corral, breath fogging, and found Truett checking the horses' hooves for ice. "You knew they'd be in trouble," she said, leaning on the fence. "I saw the wagon tracks yesterday," he replied, not looking up. "Didn't have time to follow until this morning." She watched his hands move slow and sure over the mare's leg. "You always notice things others miss." "I try to." She stepped closer. "Why didn't you tell me last night you'd been watching that ridge?" He set the hoof down gently. "Didn't seem important. You'd have come either way." She touched his sleeve. "It's important to me." He straightened, snow falling from his coat. "You don't need me to be the kind of man who says much." "I don't," she said, "but I want to know the way you think." He looked at her then, the quiet in his expression deeper than the snow around them. "I think about you most days. About how this place feels different with you in it." The wind pulled at her braid, but she didn't move. "You've given me more than shelter. You've given me purpose," he said. "And I didn't know I was missing it." They didn't touch. Didn't need to. Later, after Alma and her boy had eaten, Elira sat near the fire, shelling dried peas for stew. Alma joined her, her hands steadier now, her shoulders less tight. "You and the cowboy," Alma said, voice low. "You married?" "No," Elira said. "But we belong to each other." Alma nodded slowly. "A woman can tell when a man means what he says." "Your Truett does." Elira smiled, not out of vanity, but from the warmth of being seen. "He does." The next morning, Truett rode out to find news of Alma's kin. Elira stayed behind, teaching the boy how to mend a tear in his mittens with spare thread. When Truett returned before dusk, his face was wind-chapped, but his eyes lightened when they met hers. "Her brother passed, but there's a woman in Bozeman who took over his claim. Widow. Said she'd take them in." Alma pressed her hand to her mouth. "Thank you. We'll take you there when the road clears," he said. "If that's what you want." "It is." That night, Elira and Truett sat outside as the stars returned, faint and sharp over the empty fields. "She's braver than she knows," Elira said. "So are you," he replied. They didn't speak more, just watched the sky until the cold crept in again, and they went inside together. This time, he didn't sleep in the barn. The wagon rolled out beneath a pale sky, its wheels groaning through the thawed ruts of the trail. Elira stood beside Truett as Alma and her son waved from the bench seat, bundled in wool and gratitude. The boy clutched a wrapped loaf Elira had baked that morning without a word. When the wagon disappeared behind the rise, silence settled again, wide and open as the prairie. Truett shifted the collar of his coat higher against the wind. "She'll be all right. She'll have a chance," Elira said. "That's more than most." They walked back to the cabin without speaking. The snowbanks had softened at the edges, and the path was damp with melt. Inside, the warmth met them like a held breath. Elira set the kettle on the stove, watching steam begin to curl from the spout. Truett leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've changed this place." She turned toward him, brow raised. "It was already here. Wasn't living in it," he said. "Not the way it is now." She poured the hot water into a basin, dipping a cloth and wringing it out before wiping her hands clean. "I didn't plan any of this." "Neither did I." She looked at him directly then, her voice low but steady. "Do you want it to stay this way?" He stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. "I want you to take my name." Elira's breath caught, but she didn't move. "Because you feel you owe me something?" "No," he said. "Because I want to build a life with you. I've never asked for much, but I'd ask for that." Her eyes searched his, finding nothing there but quiet certainty. "I don't need a promise to stay, but I'll wear your name, if you'll wear mine with the same pride." He reached for her hands, rough palms closing around hers. "Then we'll carry each other's names in everything we do." They married 2 weeks later, with snow still clinging in the shadows and the creek just beginning to run again. Truett's neighbor, a weathered rancher named Merrill, rode in to witness and brought his sister to speak the vows. Elira wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin kept in a trunk beneath the bed, and Truett shaved clean for the first time since autumn. They stood under the lean branches of the cottonwood near the barn, the wind shifting just enough to lift Elira's veil as she said yes. Merrill's sister handed them a length of blue ribbon to tie around their joined wrists, and Truett's fingers wrapped over hers like they'd been waiting all his life to find that shape. Afterward, they shared bread, honey, and dried apple pie at the kitchen table, and Merrill raised a toast in his slow, graveled, deep voice. "May your house always hold laughter, and your fields always yield more than you sow." When the guests rode off, Elira stood on the porch watching the dusk settle. Truett came up behind her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders without saying a word. "Never thought I'd stand here like this," she said. "You belonged here the day you arrived," he answered. That night, they lay in the bed together as husband and wife, the fire low, her head tucked beneath his chin, his hand resting at the curve of her back. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The rhythm of his breathing said everything. By spring, the hives were built. Elira painted them white and set them near the creek where wild plum trees bloomed. Truett plowed the field behind the cabin, and she walked beside him, scattering seed into the dark, ready earth. They worked shoulder to shoulder, the way they always had, and when the day was done, they washed with cold water and shared bread by the fire. In June, the wheat lifted from the soil in tidy rows. The bees filled the air with their hum. And on the porch swing Truett had built with his own hands, Elira stitched a baby blanket from scraps of cloth she'd saved since winter, her belly gently rounded beneath her apron. Truett came up the steps with a bundle of kindling and paused when he saw her. She looked up, catching his gaze. "You still glad I stayed?" she asked. He knelt before her, resting his hand over the child growing within her. "Every day." He kissed her then, slow and sure, and she leaned into it with all the quiet trust they'd built together. The land gave hard, and the winters ran long, but their life held. The wheat ripened, the bees thrived, and their son was born in the heart of autumn with strong lungs and Truett's steady eyes. They named him Samuel, after Elira's uncle, the one who had taught her how to tend bees and keep her hands from shaking. Years passed. The cabin grew with time, a second room added, then a lean-to-shed. Children's laughter filled the fields in spring, and the porch never sat empty at sunset. Elira's hair silvered, and Truett's hands stiffened, but they still walked the rows together, their steps slow now, but always in rhythm. And every morning, before the sun touched the ridge, he kissed her cheek as she stirred the fire, and she said the same for words she'd spoken since the day they wed. "I'll stay with you." And he always answered, I know.